Douglas Woodward. If you don't know him, you're going to, and I want to highly recommend all of his works. He's an author, speaker, and researcher on the topics of apocalypticism, biblical eschatology, and American spiritual history, with 40 years' experience in researching, writing, and teaching. And I have to tell you, I know from personal experience, he is one of the best writers and researchers out there. Another next to Gary Sterman, whose work I want to steal and report it to be my own. And I mean that. That's the sin in there, as I really do want to steal his work and report it to be my own. He's written 5 books. His latest book, Power Quest Book 2, The Ascendancy of Antichrist in America, is a study on how fascism and Nazi leaders were invited into America to support anti-communist programs and tainted U.S. government policies in critical departments of the executive branch, including Justice, State, NASA, and the CIA. Doug has also served as an executive for Microsoft, Oracle, Honeywell Bull, and as a partner at Ernst & Young. He is currently president of Autometrics, a medical device company addressing improved diagnostics of middle ear infection and patented Doppler ultrasound technology. Doug is a personal friend. And if you watch Prophecy in the News, you've seen him on many of their programs as an informed expert on end times developments. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome as our first speaker this morning to this platform, Doug Woodward.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Happy Bastille Day. Storm the Bastille. So, being a former Microsoft executive, I'm embarrassed to tell you that while you're able to see my presentation, I'm not able to see my presentation on my computer. So unfortunately, I'll have to look and see what slide I'm on as we go. So anyway, well, happy 14th of July. It's great to have you here. It's great for me to be able to be here. I have in the last year seen little of my family because I've been writing 2 books, both entitled Power Quest. Power Quest happens to mean a number of different things. Certainly, as we talked last night about the spiritual history of America, Power Quest to a great extent meant the quest of individuals to become empowered by spiritual forces, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, especially when you get more to the side of the occult and witchcraft and so forth. And so that is part of the Power Quest. Book 2 gets more into the Power Quest of the U.S. government and the belief that I have that the spirit of Antichrist is alive and living, unfortunately, in America today, whether we're dealing with the financial issues of Wall Street, dealing with our government in many aspects, the military, the intelligence services, whatever. I'm going to try not to get shot today, but nevertheless, it is a well-documented fact from many documents that have been released in the last 10 to 12 years in terms of the Freedom of Information Act, very many writers and researchers and so forth that the CIA was, even before it was called the CIA, was very involved in bringing Nazis into America to the tune not just of hundreds, but of thousands, if not 10,000 or more, all illegally under the nose of the president, oftentimes breaking executive orders in terms of how they were to be allowed into the country and under what circumstances. So it's a story that we can say that we do not often hear. And so in the story, as I'll talk more, we're going to pick out one particular subject today and talk about that. So, ladies and gentlemen, put on your tinfoil hats. It's time to dig in deep to a fascinating subject. And as you look at this picture of Larry King, the positioning of the alien, Whitney Strieber's alien, I'm not intending to suggest that Larry King is a hybrid, although some of you might have thought that he is a hybrid. He certainly lived longer than most interviewers live and continues still to harangue us with various things. So some of the questions that we'll attempt to ask and answer today, one of the big ones is the whole issue of UFOs. I do not take issue with anything that an L.A. Marzulli says, or others in the audience, writers and researchers that believe that UFOs, in fact, oftentimes are not a figment of our imagination. They may, in fact, be representations of fallen angels. It could be supernatural in nature. However, there's another thread that most of us haven't heard that I found a lot of books on and research and a lot of discussions that I thought you might like to know about, and that has to do with the possibility that there's a terrestrial explanation for UFOs that you will find, I think, fascinating. NASA itself, as we'll learn, is, as Hank here, Hank worked 30 years at JPL, right? So as he said to me this morning, scientists never are neutral. They always have an opinion and they always have a point of view. And NASA, as we will learn, certainly has a point of view, and it has sort of a raison d'etre. It has sort of a reason for being that, once again, most of us have no idea why it is that so many of these rocket scientists were so eager to get to the moon. So we'll talk a bit about that. So what do the occult, or what does the occult and rocket science have in common? Actually, a lot, and we'll talk about that. Did Nazis participate in the Kennedy assassination? It's possible they did, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the evidence for that in the limited amount of time that we have, which is not a lot. And then one of the other questions is, have artifacts been found on the moon? Have they been found on Mars? And what does that mean if, in fact, artifacts from some form of intelligent life have actually been found on the moon or on Mars? And could that be one of the factors involved in why the rocket scientists were so eager to get to the moon and to get to Mars? So, official disclosure, a lot of us talk about that. There's the theory that we may soon be upon the announcement that we are indeed not alone in the universe and that there could be extraterrestrials. That's why I said get on your tinfoil hats. There could be extraterrestrials out there. That may be the, quote, official statement of the government, but it's also possible that the government will continue to basically allow the quote unquote truth about UFOs to continue to leak out slowly. Just as I guess National Geographic is doing a special now called Chasing UFOs, and they had a little sound bite. I think 31% of Americans believe in the UFOs now. So it's certainly a common thing, and if you say something about flying saucers, people don't necessarily laugh you out of Burger King or where you are. So, the mystery of iniquity. I thought about this last night and decided to add this slide because there are so many things that go on that we don't know about. And as it relates to the issue of evil and the approach of Antichrist into America, there are things that have happened for the past 50 or 60 years that we do not know about. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll know everything. Even today, I'm going to throw out a lot of data points and ideas. Many of them can't be proven. There's just a lot of information and documentation. It's kind of like evidence in the offering of a case in the court of law. The evidence tends to point one way, and based upon a reasonable doubt or lack of a reasonable doubt, the jury convicts. And that's kind of the way you have to approach this subject matter, is that the evidence tends to point one way, and you may or may not choose to believe it. Oftentimes your cosmology, your worldview, that is what influences whether or not you do believe something. And certainly I was thinking just a second ago about the lost and found. You know, a lot of us in here were at once lost, now we're found. By the way, if you are one of the lost, just talk to your neighbor. I'm sure they are not. And they'll be happy to. They probably have the 4 spiritual laws memorized and can lead you to the Lord. But nevertheless, the concept of having a worldview, having a particular understanding or interpretation of reality, that very much influences what we accept or what we deny. And certainly non-Christians are just as guilty of making assumptions as Christians are. And we happen to believe that our assumptions have been sort of baptized in biblical truth, and hopefully that's so. But everyone has a set of assumptions. Lots of great mysteries to talk about. I won't go through all of these. I'll just point out that in my new book, what I attempt to do is go through and identify various factors that have influenced America. Again, it's kind of the hidden history of America. It's public information. It's available. It's just that the books sometimes are great big and they're not books that you're necessarily going to pick out to read. So it's sort of my mission in life to read all those books that you don't have time to read and sort of figure out how I can kind of compress them down and make them accessible, because they're oftentimes hard to read and very detailed and kind of boring. But turns out there actually is some interesting information, especially when you put all these things together. And Gary Stearman accuses me of being really good at connecting the dots. So that's what I try to do, is sort of connect the dots. So the issue of mind control, the CIA's involvement. For instance, did you know in the 1960s, 1970s, the CIA at one time would spend up to $250 million a year off budget, the black ops, just to pay for books, magazine articles, newspaper articles that reinforced the opinion that the communists were going to take over the world and that we needed a stronger military presence. I'm not saying we don't need a good, strong military presence, but nevertheless, the CIA spent millions and millions of dollars year after year trying to reinforce that point of view, that worldview, into Americans. And whether that's right or wrong, I argue it's wrong. Maybe that we agree with that point of view, but I argue it's wrong that our government is spending money to try to reinforce a particular worldview upon us. We talk about remote viewing. The government made decisions back as early as in the 70s. Actually, it goes all the way back to the 1940s with individuals, a gentleman named Aleister Crowley, for those of you that may know that name, very influential in what happens at that point forward in terms of the CIA, mind control, even the interest in the pyramids of Egypt. So this is somewhat documented in the book as well, where I talk about little green men and the concept of remote viewers and how they're actually utilized by the CIA. Apparently, even I have an anecdote that I don't have time to talk about, I do in the book, that says that they still exist today, that there are certain agents of either military or the CIA that still do remote viewing in order to find out information that we would not be able to know if they didn't use their clairvoyant powers. So that's part of the story as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is specifically the space program, just for a few minutes, and talk about some of the things that you might not know about it, and what it tells us about the incursion, the infestation of the fascism and Nazism in America. So we'll start with this. How many of you remember from your philosophy class, easy for me to say, and I was like a philosophy major, that how many of you have heard about the cosmological argument? Remember St. Anselm and the first mover, there had to be a first mover and so forth. But Hitler actually had a cosmological argument as well. And you can probably read it better than I, since I can't really look over there very well. But essentially the point is that once it's determined, once it can be found out that there are little green men, or there are artifacts on the moon, or there are artifacts on Mars, that we can then do away with the mythology of Christianity. Now, why would you say that? Why would Hitler say that? Well, because the concept of the Bible is that humankind is very much at the center of God's plan. And this isn't just some little plan off in this one corner of one galaxy amongst the billions of galaxies that exist, but this plan is in fact central to the whole creation. And so Hitler was essentially saying, once we prove that there are extraterrestrials, then we can basically dispense with Christianity, because he was not a friend of Christianity, as you all might know. So many things I could get sidetracked on. Tom Horn did that well last night, but he had a way to get through it. I don't know if I can do that, so I better stay on point. So the battle for the mind really began, as I talk about both in book 1 and in book 2. The Nazis knew as soon as D-Day occurred. My dad, who's out there in the audience, by the way, came in about 2 weeks after D-Day on one of the beaches. I don't know if it was Normandy or Omaha or whatever, but he missed the big party, but he still did his time. So anyway, by just a couple of months after D-Day, the Nazis met in Luxembourg in the Maison Rouge, and they had all their businessmen for the first part of the morning, the businessmen from Volkswagen Werk and IG Farben and these different huge Nazi conglomerates that really represented the military industrial complex of Germany. They met, and Martin Bormann essentially put in place Operation Eagle Flight. And Operation Eagle Flight was to ask all of the businesses to begin to move people, monies, and assets out of Germany and move them around the world. And so that's what began to happen. So before the war ended, they were already moving monies and stock, and they were moving things around the world, people, and of course hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So he certainly used the carrot and stick. He basically said, if you don't do this, we have German agents throughout the world. They will continue to be operative after the war is over, which we will lose, but they will still be there and they will enforce this rule. So essentially, everyone is still part of the Reich, the Fourth Reich, if you will. And so that was really the plan. So the thing that is pertinent as it relates to NASA, and there are a number of researchers that talk about this, that believe that the Germans actually thought carefully through their science, their rocket science, and other science that they may have been working on as it relates to non-traditional means of propulsion. And they decided to split the scientists. Some went to the Soviet Union, some went to America, like Werner von Braun. And then they may have held back some of the smartest and the best working on a program that wouldn't be so obvious. Rockets are pretty obvious. It's kind of hard to fire them off without being seen. But flying disc, which they were working on even before World War II, flying discs are a little bit more, a little bit easier to hide, and they sneak around a little bit better. And so that is a theory that many people have gone into and talked about. So there's a possibility that that, in fact, was their plan. The overall plan that they had at kind of a spiritual or mental or intellectual level was what we could call Weltanschauungskrieg, which is basically a worldview war. You've heard of the Blitzkrieg, which was the lightning war. Well, this Weltanschauungskrieg was a worldview war, and it was tied into, very likely, this view of we must disprove Christianity. We must take steps to prove that it's not true. So there are some interesting statements, like the statement by General MacArthur, celebrating the fact, talking to the cadets at West Point, what was this, 1962, that the next war, he literally said this, the next war will be fought with beings from other planets. Now, some people said, well, MacArthur was already fading away by that point, right? That he was already losing it. But the reality is that he did say that. And so I show clips from the movie Earth versus the Flying Saucers. So you may remember even Ronald Reagan talked about this at the UN. What if he and Mikhail Gorbachev together had to face the alien invasion? Wouldn't that bring the world together? Wouldn't it be the case it would be Earth versus the flying saucers? So the question is, was that just hyperbole? Was it just a metaphor? Or is there something more to that? And so that's an interesting question to consider. Pasadena, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory where Hank worked. This, we could probably spend an hour just on this one slide talking about the cast of characters here. Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, Theodore Van Carmen, and a gentleman named L. Ron Hubbard. So these were some of the early folks that were involved in JPL. And Hank, you probably didn't know this before you started working at JPL, but they would, in their early days before they became officially the JPL, they would launch rockets and so forth, but they always timed them to fall on occult holidays. And just uncanny how that just happened. And of course, there's a ritual that Jack Parsons performed called Babylon Working. And one report I have was that it was in California, the Mojave Desert, another that was in New Mexico. But the point is that he performed a ritual which he was trying to call forth the whore of Babylon, a homunculus. He was trying to create a creature. And he claimed that when he went back to Pasadena, there was a woman there that had never been there before named Marjorie Cameron. And so they were all convinced that her presence, who he became attached to romantically, you might say romantically, that was part of the Babylon working. But there are other theories that he opened a portal, and that in opening this portal, it turns out I should stop and say Aleister Crowley, where he fits in. Jack Parsons, in addition to being one of the founding members of JPL, he was also the chapter leader or president of the Ordo Temple Orientis, Aleister Crowley's occult society, performed sexual magic that dwarfed anything that the Freemasons were looking at. So Crowley was actually the spiritual mentor of Jack Parsons. So you have an incredible story of how the occult was very much at the heart and soul of JPL. Even today, I'll talk more about Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra and their book Dark Mission, but even today in JPL, my brother, his son-in-law, works at JPL and is actually kind of the responsible mission manager for the current Mars project that I think is going to land on Mars next month, if I'm not mistaken. Well, this is a little anecdote, so pay attention. You won't hear this anywhere else but here. So my brother's son-in-law, my brother Phil, his son-in-law works at JPL, runs this program, and he was surprised when the leaders of JPL came up to him and said, "Put a microphone on that rig." He said, "Microphone? Who are we going to talk to?" Well, they just said, "Put a microphone on it." So he put a microphone on it. So I don't know who they're planning to talk to when it lands on Mars, but nevertheless, he was ordered to put a microphone on it. So we'll see. Maybe they were just wanting to hear the ambient noise. Maybe they were wanting to hear the strange noises that are coming out of the heavens. I don't know. But nevertheless, there's still a lot of mysticism going on at JPL. L. Ron Hubbard, interesting guy, may have been a military intelligence agent. That's what a lot of people say. He was in Navy intelligence. They suggest that he may have gone to JPL just to basically keep an eye on this German, von Karman, who you couldn't really trust his loyalties, obviously, because he was a German. And then you had Jack Parsons, and everybody knew that Jack Parsons was spaced out. So L. Ron Hubbard was basically put there originally to keep an eye on them, very likely. Well, it turns out there were all kinds of affairs, there were all kinds of sexual rituals, and so L. Ron Hubbard runs off to Florida with Jack Parsons' wife, and it's just an amazing story. So the others say that L. Ron Hubbard actually said that someday I'm going to show you, I'm going to create a religion based on science fiction, and I'm actually going to get people to believe in it. Ask Katie Holmes, right? So L. Ron Hubbard. So a lot of what he infused into Scientology came out of his experiences when he was at JPL, when he was working with Jack Parsons. So again, you've got this amazing occult background. We don't hear about these things, do we? Nazi flying saucers. Is it just possible that at least some of the early flying saucers in kind of the modern era, by the way, flying saucers, flying objects, they date back to pre-Bible times. I mean, they've always been around. There have always been signs in the sky, some of them far more unusual than the signs that we see today. But nevertheless, is it possible that some of the flying machines that were going on in the 1940s and 1950s were in fact put there by the Nazis? There is a lot of documentation that suggests that that's in fact true. If you look at Kenneth Arnold on the far left, he was drawing this picture of what he saw. I believe it was 7 planes in a tight formation flying around Mount Rainier, which is where I live these days. Have for about 20 years, by the way. And it just looks a lot like the Horton 229, which was the first flying wing, predated our flying wing, the stealth fighter, by how many years? 50 years? So the Nazis, there's a lot of different theories about how the Nazis knew so much. All these mediums that were talking to all these aliens, that's what they said. Even as early as the 1919, 1920 time frame, Maria Orsic was talking to aliens from Aldebaran. Sounds a lot like Alderaan, doesn't it? Does anybody remember what Alderaan is? Yeah, they blew it up. That's the home of Princess Leia Organa. That's right, in Star Wars. So, Aldebaran versus a real star, 65 million light years from Earth, and then there's Princess Leia. so, or 65 light years from Earth. It's just, what's a light year here or there? So anyway, there's a pretty good argument that George Lucas knows his space history, and he understands a lot of the occult as well. And then there's the story about the CIA operations, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, which are just some more crazy facts that are part of the story. This one's kind of interesting for those that are science fiction buffs. This is the story of the Nazi bell, which of course the Nazis would call the Glock. The Glock. And so the bell, and interesting, in the first book of Power Quest, I talk about the alternative physics. The Nazis stated that the theory of relativity and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, they said that is Jewish science, and they would have none of it. So they basically searched for an alternative science, an alternative physics, and they actually had one in the wings. And there was this interesting gentleman named Carl Maria Willigut. And Willigut was basically sort of, he was Heinrich Himmler's occult teacher and mentor. And Willigut actually had these occult theories about the nature of physics that they tested, and many believe that they actually created the bell. And the concept was what's called torsion physics, in which we have to take a Coke can and we twist it and we crunch it down. And that's what they believed, that you could actually take the nature of time-space and you can actually manipulate it. It's engineerable. And so what they did is they created this bell where it had these counter-rotating discs running at super high speeds, and they believed they were actually engineering or changing space-time. Joseph P. Farrell in his books talks a great deal about this. There's a whole slew of books written about the Nazi bell as a possible precursor to a time machine. And at the very least, they felt they could either slow down or speed up the passing of time. But they also felt through the same physics that they could get to what's called zero-point energy, or free energy. Nikola Tesla, those of you may be familiar with Tesla, and the same concept. Tesla was basically ready to demonstrate to the world how energy just existed all around us in the ether, just the reality that's all around us. We could actually tap into that, and we could actually provide free energy to the world. Well, his financier was a guy named J.P. Morgan. Well, what did J.P. Morgan own? Standard Oil and most of the petroleum industry. He didn't want anyone to have free energy. Well, the Nazis, of course, they kind of wanted to have free energy because they were having to depend upon sources outside of Germany for their energy, primarily General Motors, by the way, secondarily Ford. Ford actually decided not to provide trucks to England so they could provide trucks to Germany. There are German scientists, German military men that said, if we had not had the synthetic fuel that GM provided, and if we didn't have the heavy-duty trucks that Ford provided, the Blitzkrieg could never have happened. Our fuel did not have the ethanol quality that it needed to have for these big trucks. So it was essentially American corporations that enabled the Germans to carry out World War II. I'll tell you one more little anecdote. The Americans, John J. McCloy from Union Bank and the Harrimans, the Bushes, Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush, was a senator, I believe from Connecticut, and he was on the board of the American Silesian Corporation. Well, they put together an industrial park. They put it at this kind of junction of a number of rivers in Poland. And they thought they were going to build this industrial park. They had barges, they created railway lines, and they were all coming together into this one area, and they intended it to be a great big profit center. Little did they know, they were creating what the Germans called Auschwitzen, and the Jews called Auschwitz. So they laid, literally American corporations laid the tracks down to enable the shipping of obviously millions of Jews to Auschwitz. And so they transformed the industrial park into a killing machine. So anyway, as we say here, that the Glock is sort of a transformational technology, a gateway technology. Itself, not necessarily a flying saucer, but it might have pointed the way to creation of flying disc. Now here are some really interesting facts, so make sure that your tinfoil hats are really tied on tight here. Because now we get into what is the relationship between the Nazis and NASA and flying saucers and the JFK assassination. Who would think that, what kind of weird mind would it take to connect those dots, right? Well, it turns out me, but there's other weird minds as well that have connected these dots, and I'm not the first. I'm mainly kind of a middleman. I'm just trying to interpret these things and put these things in a Christian context to make it a bit easier for folks that don't take the time or don't have the time, like I have been able to find, to read about these things. Well, it turns out, how many of you all saw the movie JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK? It was a big movie, so quite a few of you did. Well, you're going to remember a couple of characters in that movie. Clay Shaw, he was the one they actually tried as a member of, they said he was, Jim Garrison said, oh, he's CIA. Everybody goes, CIA, sure, he's CIA. Well, he was CIA. That was proven later on in the House Committee on Assassinations. They investigated and said, yeah, he was CIA. And Tommy Lee Jones played Clay Shaw, right? Did a great job. Well, Clay Shaw was the owner of the World Mart or Metro Mart or whatever it was called in New Orleans. But anyway, that was his cover. But he was definitely CIA. And he was involved in the early stages of Operation Paperclip, moving the German rocket scientists to America. He met with Walter Dornberger, who later went on to become a key executive at Bell Helicopter. And he met with another gentleman called Werner von Braun. And he was instrumental in getting them into the United States. And so he continued to have relationships. Then there's this guy named Fred Crispin. For those of you that know the history of UFOs, Fred Crispin reported seeing UFOs over Tacoma and over, maybe it was over Vancouver, before Ken Arnold saw his set of UFOs. And of course, these things were happening right at the same time as Roswell was happening, 1947. So isn't this curious that you've got these individuals, and then you have Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was played by Ed Asner in the movie. You may remember that. Well, after Roswell, 3 days after Roswell's announced in the paper, and then later, of course, quieted down, you've got Bannister reporting from Twin Falls, Idaho. It's in the Associated Press, July 11th, 1947, 3 days after Roswell. He's reporting UFOs that he saw in Idaho. What is it about all of these CIA operatives and their connection with the JFK assassination and the fact that they were up to their earlobes in reporting UFOs? All kinds of theories could be advanced, but the most compelling one is that the military was already involved in architecting an explanation possibly for the presence of German technology, of flying discs that were going on in the world that they could not control. Why? Because a deal may have been struck between Martin Bormann and many American financiers. He was going to move literally $1 billion or more out of Europe, that's a lot of money in World War II, out of Europe and into banks owned by the City of London and Wall Street. And so he may have, according to Joseph Farrell and several others, he may have come up with a way to bargain for his own freedom and the freedom of many other Germans. The rat lines of Argentina, I talk about that. There's even a theory that Hitler escaped. I don't really believe it, but it's an interesting theory. But anyway, Bormann was very involved in this possibility as well. So you have these crazy coincidences. Can we get to the bottom of this? I don't know, but isn't it an interesting fact? So then you have, of course, Werner von Braun, and you have his scientists from Operation Paperclip. Most of you have heard about that. This is 150 scientists that were located at Fort Bliss, just across the border. Fort Bliss, isn't that a great name for a military base in El Paso, Texas? Somebody has really a sense of humor. I mean, that's especially today. Can you imagine what it's going to feel like at Fort Bliss today? But anyway, you've got Kennedy and von Braun. You've got Hermann Oberth. There's I got that little picture up in the upper right-hand corner. That's Werner von Braun, who was SS member, by the way, and his friends, other SS members, obviously still when he was in Germany. and then you got the Paperclip scientist down there. So what do these guys have to do? Peenemünde was the German rocket science base in Germany that eventually the Allies were able to reach and begin to bomb, so they had to begin to move all the rocket scientists away from Peenemünde. Peenemünde, by the way, refers to the angel, I believe it's Peenemünde, and that angel was one of the ones mentioned in the book of Enoch. It's the angel of writing and the angel that supposedly brought great wickedness to earth. Just an interesting anecdote. I don't know if there's really a lot of meaning there, but here's what Werner von Braun said, if I can read it. We find, this was something he said in 1959. Now think about this. This is a statement he made publicly. It was really never repeated outside of this speech, never brought back when we were launching Apollo and Gemini and so forth. But this is what von Braun said. We find ourselves faced by powers which are far stronger than we had hitherto assumed, and whose base is at present unknown to us. More I cannot say at present. We are now engaged in entering into close, what does it say? Oh, and then I went too far, I think, close contact with these powers, and in 6 or 9 months' time, it may be possible to speak with more precision on the matter. What's he inferring? He's probably not talking about the Soviets. He's talking about some other power that he doesn't want to communicate about. This is never really brought up in discussion again in the public sector. Then you've got Oberth, who made these statements. Very hard to read. I'm going to see if I can step over here and read them for you. Now, he is saying this in 1968. He says, today we cannot produce machines that fly as UFOs do. They are flying by means of artificial fields of gravity. This is a public statement. This would explain the sudden changes of directions. This hypothesis would also explain the piling up of these disks into a cylindrical or cigar-shaped mothership, shades of Independence Day, upon leaving the Earth, because in this fashion only one field of gravity would be required for all disks. So they're talking about anti-gravity propulsion. They produce high-tension electric charges in order to push the air out of their path, and strong magnetic fields to influence the ionized air at higher altitudes. This would explain their luminosity. Secondly, it would explain the noiselessness of UFO flight. Finally, this assumption also explains the strong electrical and magnetic effects, sometimes, but not always, observed in the vicinity of UFOs. So these are the rocket scientists at the helm of NASA. And they're talking about the possibility of extraterrestrials. Sometimes they deny it, sometimes they talk about it, but clearly they seem to be trying to do their best to confuse us. And of course, in this context, we find President Eisenhower, upon his departure, talking about beware the military-industrial complex. If you haven't read that speech, you can find it online. Just Google it, read it. It is staggering what he was really saying in the context of what was going on with all of these Germans being poured into the American military-industrial complex. That's what was happening. Germany was basically, the Third Reich was basically moving into many of these American corporations and taking principal roles as engineers and scientists and sometimes as management, and they were influencing the direction of where America was going. So the thesis, for instance, of Oliver Stone's movie, that really what was happening was that Kennedy was standing up to and opposed to the military-industrial complex, is a very powerful, very compelling argument. So there's Walter Dornberger, formerly at Bell Helicopter before that, obviously there with the Nazis. You got Arthur Rudolph, eventually had to get up, he was the father of the Atlas rocket. And I didn't say before, Jack Parsons was actually the father of solid rocket fuel. He wasn't really the father, but he was the one that actually made it work. It was based upon Greek fire. That was based upon some occult technology, and it used asphalt as a basis. But anyway, so you have Arthur Rudolph. Arthur Rudolph was involved in the metal works in I believe it's Nordhausen, which is where they moved some of the work after Peenemünde was too dangerous to still occupy. And he oversaw many Jewish slaves working underground in building the V2 and perhaps other rockets. And basically, if they didn't meet their quota, he would put more slaves in the tunnels, and until many slaves died, many Jews died in these tunnels. Well, eventually this truth found him out, and he was investigated eventually and defrocked, unfortunately a little bit like Joe Paterno maybe. And in 1987 he lost his American citizenship. I think he moved to Canada. But anyway, he was no longer welcomed in America once it was found out. Arthur M. Young, how much time do I have? A minute. He's a fascinating guy, another occult spiritualist, very involved in the first meetings with the Nine back in 1950, I think it was 51, 52. I go into all this in the book, but there's even Gene Roddenberry, John Denver. These guys were involved with Arthur M. Young in a lot of the early on mediums that were channeling and talking to the Nine. Remember Tom's allusion last night to the 9 gods of the Olmecs and the Mayans and so forth coming back to Earth? Well, the 9, they're also known as the 9, the Aeneid, the 9 of Egypt, and supposedly the 9. Peter Levenda talks about the 9 in his first book, Sinister Forces. So supposedly this is the pantheon of these Egyptian gods. Just another little interesting fact. The Torbit document is a document that's published that goes into specifics about who was involved, how was NASA involved. There was a Swiss corporation. It goes through and it names names. Is it reliable? We don't know. It might have been reliable, it might not be reliable, but it's incredibly detailed and talks about the relationship of NASA, a particular group called DISC, I think it was the Defense Industrial Security Command, that worked for NASA, the Atomic Energy Commission, and others that may have been involved, along with a number of other interesting organizations, mostly the oil lobby and the oil conglomerates, Bunky Hunt and so forth, and they may have been involved. The issue about why was JFK killed, literally people were taking tickets at the door to kill him. Whether it was over the moving away from basically the Federal Reserve System, going back to enabling the Treasury of the United States to produce its own money. All of this was part of the story, there's no question about it. But he was clearly standing opposed to the military-industrial complex. He and Khrushchev were working things out, but probably one of the key issues was that he and Khrushchev were working together to have a joint space program to go to the moon together. The Germans would not have wanted that to happen. The Germans wanted to keep their enemies split. When they hired this guy named Richard Gehlen, he was basically the German Nazi responsible for all the German intelligence in Eastern Europe and Russia. They brought him in and all of his group in the CIA. Allen Dulles is the bad guy here, the former head of the CIA that Kennedy fired. He was so angry with Dulles because of all the things that Dulles had done for years and years and years. Kennedy said, I'm going to smash the CIA into 1,000,000 pieces. Well, the CIA probably was responsible for Kennedy's death, but they weren't only responsible. Everybody, there were so many people that had it out for Kennedy. Kennedy's death, whether you're a Kennedy fan or not, goodness knows he had lots of human problems, and those are well documented. And so we know that, and yet it's very likely that that the Kennedy death was a milestone. It was a watershed moment for America. Oh, I kind of completely went past the fact I didn't talk about the Washington flap. Let me make that point. Exactly 60 years ago this weekend, Washington, D.C., in probably the greatest display of UFOs ever, 2 weekends in a row, was inundated with flying saucers. This spurred some of the first science fiction movies about UFOs. But this was in 1952, in July of 1952, 60 years ago, this weekend, or kind of this week. And the Air Force scrambled jets to respond. It was all abuzz. The largest press conference ever held was held just after this. And the question was, well, why was the Air Force panicked? You had pilots from National Airlines on the runway at what is now Reagan Airport talking about these flying discs. This was the most highly witnessed UFO experience perhaps in the United States history. Don't hear much about it now. But you had all these qualified experts that were talking about these UFOs. And this was before you could say UFO and be considered a crackpot, of course. So the Washington flap was probably, the fear was that, oh my goodness, the Germans really do have flying saucers and we can't touch them. Well, these flying saucers or flying discs, if that's what they were only able to fly between about 1,000 miles per hour and 2,500 miles per hour. So it's not exactly Star Trek speed. So that's one of the arguments against these being extraterrestrial objects, is that they never really were able to fly faster than about 2,500 or Mach 3. So yes, they could do strange things because apparently of some of their anti-gravity capabilities, but nevertheless, they were still probably, the first go-around were probably jet-propelled aircraft. So, but so much to talk about, so little time. So, the rituals of NASA. Hoagland's book, a 600-page tome on the story. In fact, real quick anecdote since Hank is here. And one of the stories, when the first photo came back from the Mars lander, and it showed this terrain, it looked very Earth-like. In fact, the sky was beautiful blue, looked just like a sunny day on Earth. The order went down. Hank will verify this. He was there when this happened. The order went down, take that photo off the screen. Thereafter, photos that were shown always had a very reddish cast to them. They didn't look like they were Earth-like at all. Okay? And so you have the fascinating story, don't have time to talk about it, about the Masons and how the Masons were in most of the leadership positions of NASA, and then they were eventually overtaken by the Nazis, von Braun and his henchmen. So there was an internal battle going on between even different ideologies within NASA, but the Germans eventually took the controlling positions. Well, it's interesting, when they had their first launch area in the White Sands, New Mexico, they named it Launch Area 33. It was the only one they had, but they named it 33. And then they had the runway at Kennedy. They didn't have 33 runways, but they named one of their runway, or their only runway 33. So there's all this mystical, 33 of course a very important number in the Freemasons and their ideology and so forth. This whole thing about the ritual alignment model, which is Hoagland's theory, that when NASA landed on the moon and so forth, that they did it at exactly a precise time with certain stars in certain alignment, always at the number of 19.5 or 33. So there's just a huge amount of information on that. I'm just about done here. Alien ruins on Mars and the moon. Hoagland spends a great deal of time in his book Dark Mission trying to prove that there have been found artifacts on the moon. There were crystal domes on the moon, perhaps 1 million years ago, trying to prove that there were intelligent beings prior to the current human race, the pre-Adamic race, perhaps. And so this is a portion of his story, but he also basically is saying this was NASA's mission. You certainly find out that Werner von Braun didn't really want to lob V2s over and destroy civilians in London. He did that. His real goal was to get to the moon. And so much of the theory the theory I have is that many of these Germans were actually seeking to fulfill Hitler's cosmological argument. That in fact, they were seeking to get to the moon and getting to Mars to try to prove that there have been intelligences in our solar system prior to the human race, essentially the modern human race. And so it's a theory, can't prove it, maybe part of the mystery of iniquity. It's just one little slice I talk about in PowerQuest Book 2. Collins Elite, don't have time to talk about it. This is a group, however, I'll just mention this, a group within, sort of just, it's in the government, but it's kind of outside of the CIA, outside of NASA and so forth. Nick Redfern has written a book called Final Event. The Collins Elite is a group, mostly Christians, that believe that the whole alien thing, in fact, is a hoax. That, in fact, it is a satanic event. And that we're moving towards a final climactic event in which Satan and his hordes are going to be unleashed upon the earth. These were scientists that became convinced, based upon their investigation into the whole alien abduction phenomenon and so forth, that that's in fact where we're heading. So I talk a bit about that in the book. And then what comes next? The last slide here. How many of you have seen the movie Prometheus? Pretty spectacular movie. At the core of that, of course, is the fact that not only were intelligent beings and not Jehovah, these intelligent beings were our creators, but as I said last night, they're giants as well. And they are responsible. And I made mention of this last night. If you remember the novel Frankenstein, the subtitle was The Modern Prometheus. It was the concept of creating life from non-living matter, and that humankind has become the creator. So all the discussions Tom Horn and others have had on transhumanism, all this is very pertinent. So a lot of facts to connect, but the essential story here is that there's a sense that the ideology that permeated the occult theories of the Nazis, that ideology was very much at play in America's space program. So with that, we will stop. Bring up the house lights if you would. We have time for maybe a couple of questions, if there's any questions. Someone in the back, you need to yell loud though. Yeah, there is a mic, so wait for just a second and we'll get you a mic. Okay?
Can you touch on New Schwabenland?
New Schwabenland. Actually, I can't. I'm not familiar with New Schwabenland. So you'll have to tell me about that, though, later, all right? It's kind of what I've been involved in the last 10 years, or startups. So.
Question here.
Yes.
Did Armstrong and Aldrin really walk on the moon? And if so, how did they get through the Van Allen belts?
Okay. Well, I'm not a scientist, so in terms of being able to talk through the Van Allen belt issue, I don't know the answer to that. My theory is that, yes, they did walk on the moon. I believe that that's true. There's, of course, a whole story. Capricorn 1, the movie, was faking the Mars landing, and one of the famous stars of that was O.J. Simpson. So probably not a movie you're going to see very much anymore. But I happen to believe they did. There's a whole other theory about when they took off from the moon's surface, they were able to be propelled much faster, and it implied that the moon's hollow, it's an artificial satellite. I mean, this stuff just goes on and on. It's endless. It's back to the mystery of iniquity. There's so many things we're not going to know this side of the rapture. Yes. Yes.
Is the sudden dissolving of NASA recently related to this?
You know, I don't know that it is. It may have been. It may be because it's lost its reason for being. It may be. I don't know. I think that the whole issue, we're certainly just practical questions of the economy. But one could look at it and say, well, perhaps it's lost its reason for being, its reason d'etre, and so it's proven what it was to prove at this point. But there's still others that argue we need to go there. It's the remote viewers today that are talking about caverns and Mars and their viewing of, Cydonia, which I showed the picture of the face on Mars and the city of Cydonia. This whole theory that Hoagland has that it was actually a concept of a geometrical shapes, that we're talking about certain physical properties that are part of what we call this alternative physics, the non-Jewish physics, if you will. And so all this stuff is interconnected in just unbelievable ways. So, yes?
At the end of World War II, we absorbed a lot of the Nazi rocket scientists and their other scientists. What about their extensive work that they did on eugenics and genetics?
Yes.
Could that have anything to do with these so-called grays that people say seem to be asexual, unable to reproduce on their own?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will tell you this. I have a chapter on eugenics in the new book, and what most Americans will not realize is that Hitler's ideology, almost all of it came from America. The president of Stanford wrote a book, talked about race and blood. The Harrimans, Mrs. Harriman funded the what was it called, cold water facility out in Long Island. Charles Davenport, Henry Laughlin. The whole issue, the gas chamber was invented for American mental patients that needed to be eliminated. The concept of the Nordic race, the Aryan race, this was at the center of the eugenics movement. The idea that we needed to get away from the blacks in America, from the Mexicans. We needed to have blonde-haired, blue-eyed Americans, pure-blood Americans. That's what they said. Of course, we're all mutts. I'm a mutt. But that's what, I would not be acceptable in their eyes. So eugenics was carried out in the 1890s, 1900, 1905. One of the key things that Hitler referred to in Mein Kampf was a Supreme Court decision in America, Buck versus Bell, where basically the Supreme Court case was whether or not Carrie Buck should be sterilized. There were over 60,000 sterilizations, forced sterilizations in America. State of Virginia, state of California led the way. Americans basically educated the Nazis on the whole issue of eugenics. So anyway, Oliver Wendell Holmes made the statement in a Supreme Court opinion that Hitler quoted that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So he fully supported the concept. The elites, the wealthy elites, they would, if they had their way, eliminate most of us in this room because we're all mutts. So that much I can tell you. The question was whether or not when they landed the actual lunar excursion module on the moon's surface, and they had to do some things manually, was that in fact what happened? I don't have any information to the contrary. You may have heard something though that's different.
I've heard that sort of, well, most of us probably heard that sort of time.
Yeah.
The pilot had to take over control.
Yeah.
Had to pick out a spot.
Armstrong. Yeah.
Didn't want to land in those.
In the crater. Yeah. Could have been bad.
So I think the Lord was probably in control there.
Perhaps. Perhaps. Well, I think Armstrong. They were both Masons. Right after, I think it was exactly 19 minutes after they landed, Buzz Aldrin was performing some kind of a Masonic rite where he was taking communion. But the argument was he wasn't taking Christian communion. He was taking communion had to do with Osiris and Isis. It was part of a Masonic ritual. So, so who knows? That's a theory that's happened supposedly. Sir. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. This lady back here has been waiting. She's had a microphone. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I'm the only one in the room that doesn't know about JPL. Can you tell a little bit?
Jet Propulsion Laboratory? Yes, misnamed because it was never about jets. It was about rockets. It was about creating rocket fuel because rockets had this tendency, this really bad tendency, to blow up on the launch pad. And so they discovered, and this is where Jack Parsons came in, that solid rocket fuel was much easier to manipulate and didn't have the tendency to blow up. All right, and so the reason they called it Jet Propulsion Laboratory was they were still living in the era of Flash Gordon, and rockets had a bad name. Oh, rocket science, yeah, sure. So they called it jet-assisted takeoff, but it was rocket. They actually were experimenting. That little picture of von Karman there, that was the first jet-assisted takeoff. It was a rocket-based airplane. So that's why they called it Jet Propulsion Laboratory. But anyway, it's been responsible. It's been a key partner with NASA and really the rocket science of actually making the rockets work. Hank could do better. He was there for 30 years. So you could explain a lot more. But that's probably the gist of it. Yes, 2 minutes. That maybe means we have 1 or 2 more questions. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've heard in the wings that the reason why they wanted to go to the moon is because there was a space station on the dark side. I know this is weird. I know it's odd, but it's a question and something, maybe.
Well, it's certainly a theory. Even if you remember in grade school, we saw Disney's movie about going to the moon or the Mars mission. Well, one of the scenes, and if you go back, and you probably won't have a chance, but if you go back and look, when von Braun is very much featured in this movie, Disney was a 33rd degree Mason as well. But as the spaceship is circling the moon, and it's on the backside, we're on the backside of the moon now. Oh, there's a space base there. Actually says that in the little movie for kids. So it's theorized that yes, the aliens or somebody has had some intelligence has a base from the far side of the moon, but it's probably not important one way or the other, because there's so much other stuff going on. So some people believe that von Karman, the mastermind of German science, that after the war ended, he jumped in the bell and flew off to another space-time dimension. So it's theorized that they perfected it. Originally, it would turn all the plant life around it to goo, and several people were killed. The scientists that were working on it, though, at the end of the war, this is Igor Wyszkowski, I think, that did the research on this in Poland. where there's this giant sort of Stonehenge-like thing was, where the bell supposedly was levitating and all that. There were like 22 scientists that were assassinated at the end of the war because they did not want that information to leak out to the Allies. So there was something going on. I got to cut it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's great.